Welcome to this tutorial on Enterprise SaaS user setup and access, or in other words, an overview of identity and user management for the administrators to get users set up to access Enterprise SaaS from the Oracle Utilities Business Unit. That includes Customer Cloud Service, Meter Solution Cloud Service, and Work and Asset Cloud Service. Cover three main sections in this tutorial. First off, a background on the Identity Cloud Service, which is an included service in Enterprise SaaS. And then we'll look at the actual administrator creation steps for creating users, groups, and linking to grant access. And then we'll take a look at how you manage the concept of template users inside the Enterprise SaaS application. So first off, a little background on Identity Cloud Service. We often refer to it as IDCS. IDCS is an identity management service. It handles the authentication, login for users, manages their user information and passwords, and has administrative capabilities for managing some of the settings around those activities. We'll also look at what we call the user management user interfaces that are available through the Oracle Cloud Account, which behind the scenes tie back to IDCS and keep the data in sync for users and groups. And at the end, as mentioned, we'll look at the just-in-time creation of Enterprise SaaS users inside of the application and how we link template users in the application to group membership in IDCS. This is a quick view of the dashboard for Identity Cloud Service. We'll actually come back around to this a bit later in the tutorial, because you won't always need to come to the Identity Cloud dashboard in order to do common day-to-day tasks, but you will need to come here for administrative action. Okay, now let's move to part two of creating users and granting access to the Enterprise SaaS application environments. As mentioned, the cloud account, the Oracle Cloud Account and IDCS are linked behind the scenes. And that gives you a couple different ways of doing the same task, creating users, linking users to groups. There's a couple different flows, and we'll look at snapshots of both of those. The thing to note as an administrative point is that neither the Cloud Account nor IDCS takes you directly to the UGBU Enterprise SaaS application environments. The URLs for those environments are sent separately by email, and it's only by accessing those URLs with authentication done by IDCS that the user actually gets to one of the application environments. So this is really geared toward identity administrators who will be managing setup and creation of new users. So this is a view from the Cloud Account. You may be familiar with this from earlier sessions on Cloud Account overview. From within the Cloud Account, there is a shortcut mechanism to get to user management, and that's through the hamburger menu up in the top left corner. If you bring that down, you'll find a user's top level menu and then an identity menu beneath that. And if you select that, you'll get to a user management screen, something like this. This is, as mentioned, kind of a simplified view that just gives you access for some of the common tasks that are done in terms of creating users, creating groups, and viewing them. In the default view, you get a list of the users that are set up within your Cloud Account, within your IDCS instance. The users, you can also get a view of groups. You can click on a user to do a few actions, as well as see groups and the membership of the group. And you can add a user through the add button here. So let's back up a bit. The key entities that you'll be managing as an administrator are really boiled down to user and group, as I've mentioned. User can typically represents a person, or can be a kind of system login access. For instance, a user that's created for calling web services behind the scenes and part of an integration. And then group is essentially just a grouping that links to many users and to many what we call application roles. And we'll talk about that next. So you'll be creating, as an administrator, users and groups. You'll be linking those to some objects that we create as part of the provisioning of the SaaS service. And those are essentially applications, and you get one application for each environment. So a dev, a test, a prod environment, typically for Enterprise SaaS. And then for each application, there are many application roles that we set up. And those application roles provide different kind of access to various services that are available for each environment. The key starting point roles to be concerned with are, as shown here, App User, which is for just regular people logging into an environment. App Web Service is for integration purposes, to have the ability and access to call web services in the environment. The two BI prefixed roles are for reporting using BI Publisher. So there's consumer and content author. And then you'll actually find additional app roles for testing roles and analytics roles. We won't go into all the details. Those are documented as part of the service. But the concept is the same in terms of how you link and give access via an application role. So next we'll look at how these users and groups kind of link to the application and roles. This is a simplified diagram, but the idea here is that a user, in this example of Janet Smith, could either be directly linked to an application role or linked via membership in a group. And our recommendation for most purposes is that you'll want to create groups that are linked to app roles. And then anyone who joins that group gets all the rights, access rights that are granted to that group. And it's just a bit easier to manage, since you know that everyone who's part of CSR group can be managed in one place by changing the rights of that group. And we call that indirect access when it's via a group. Okay, so groups kind of come first then. You need a group with access, and then you can link a new user to that group. So we consider the group as part of kind of your basic configuration. You can start off very simply with one or two groups that give access to your environments for project purposes. As you gain more expertise on how you'd like to divide the different user roles and so forth, you will likely come up with additional groups that you'll want to use as you move toward go live and testing and go live. So first we look at the flow for adding a new group. Very simple, just needs a name. Really a name is all that's required, and then a description is optional, and you can add a group, and that's all there is to it for the group itself. And then you'll be wanting to link it to one or more roles. And this is a view for some initial group that you're creating, where you're linking that group to give it access to various roles. Now notice in this view, as I mentioned, these are a list of applications. So CCS Dev is Customer Cloud Service Dev environment. CCS Prod is the Prod environment. And you can add roles which roles and which environments do you want to link to this particular group. There are a couple shortcut buttons that you can use that will throw a bunch of roles onto the group, or you can handpick them through the user interface. And you won't be giving, typically other than administrators, they will not get access, for example, to the Identity Cloud service. That's restricted to your administrator folks. Here's another view of the logical view of the entities and what the setup involves. So this one gives a little bit more detail. If we start at the bottom, the application and application roles are provided as part of the product setup. So when we provision the system, we'll set up an application for each environment that you have and a set of application roles for each environment. You, as part of your initial kind of configuration, can start setting up groups that you control, and you say what that group can be linked to in terms of application role access. And so typically the group setup is, a one-time thing with minimal management over time. The more common and most common action will be creating new users and linking them to groups. And that's these green boxes. So we'll look next at kind of the flow for creating a user and linking the user to an existing group. Okay. So creating users. Again, we'll just go through the user management screens to see how that works. One thing to note here is that you create the user once, regardless of how many environments you have in your cloud account or IDCS. You create one user record. That user has a login ID and password that is used across all environments that that user is given access to. So authentication, and once authenticated, it's a kind of single sign-on to those environments. So you could, once you've signed on, you could link to multiple environments in the same browser without new logins. So the create user action, also pretty straightforward. From user management screens, you essentially go through an add user flow. First name, last name, and email are all that's really required. One way of doing it is having the email address that you provide be their login username, but you could also decide not to do it that way and use some other unique value as their username, but they do need a real password to manage password resets and so forth. If you hit next on this screen after filling in these values, you'll get a screen for setting up direct access to app roles. We recommend not using that, just saving the user without creating any direct access, and rather linking the new user to an existing group. So from user management, you would find the group you'd like to add them to. In this case, I've picked the CSR group. I switch to the user view of that group to see that currently it's got 2 users. If I hit the add to group button on this screen, I will get a dialog somewhat like this pop up that lists out other users who are not yet in this group. We could pick our Janet Smith, who we just added, and the add button will come on. We can save that. And then Janet is part of that group. Okay, so we've just looked at user management flows. You can do the same things going directly to the IDCS dashboard and menus. The flows are a little bit different, but they achieve the exact same effect of creating users, creating groups, linking users to groups. We saw this dashboard previously. As you can see, it kind of focuses around the values that we've talked about in terms of users, groups, and applications. There's a couple ways of using this dashboard. You can click on icons to kind of drill in to see the users, see the groups. You can also use the menu up in the top left corner to access those views as well as some other settings that we'll see in a moment. If you do go into users and add users from IDCS directly, as you can see, it's kind of an even more simple screen with first name, last name, email. And you would fill those in and hit the next button. When you hit next, your step 2 in IDCS is to link that user to one or more groups. Here we could say we want Janet Smith to go into the CSR group. We'd select it, hit finish, and she would be a member of that group in this flow. What happens after you've created a new user, and since the system has their email, basically an email will be sent out to that user with a link to activate their account. And what that really means is essentially to set a permanent, semi-permanent password. And they're essentially given temporary rights. They set their own password. That password will get rotated, will have to be rotated on a regular basis, but you are in charge of the settings on how often the rotation needs to happen. One other thing to note is that the activation email that goes out is not immediate. That gives you some time to kind of make any adjustments you need to in terms of setting up the user's access before they are notified that they've been created. Within IDCS, there are some administrator views that you can use to verify who's got access to what, is what it boils down to. So for instance, if you're looking, in this case, a view of the CCS test environment, and you want to see what users or groups are assigned, you can view it by this mechanism. If you click on these buttons, you can get a view that shows both direct and indirect access, what users are assigned to the test environment. As mentioned, there are also some administrative settings that are available only in the IDCS menus. If you go to the hamburger menu and bring out the menu here, these are just shortcuts on top to the users, groups, and applications. But then under the settings menu, you'll find a number of other values that give you the capability to change, essentially, or manage the emails, for example, that are set when user events happen, such as new user creation or password reset, those kinds of things. You also have password policy, rules about length and special characters and so forth on what you're going to require in your world. One thing to note here is, while object storage is also a key part of and used by the Enterprise SaaS environments, the management of identity is separate for the most part, other than at the administrative level. For users who need access to object storage to move files in and out, they essentially will get a separate user record for object storage that you manage in a very similar fashion to what we've just looked at, but it is separate. And I recommend reviewing the object storage overview for more information and details on how that works. Okay, final section is on the users and template users inside the application environments and how that works and ties together with IDCS. So the Enterprise SaaS applications are built on a common framework that we call OUAF, or Oracle Utilities Application Framework. It's got a user record inside of each application environment has a user record. There's a couple key fields on it. One is a user ID, which is just a unique key. It's an 8-character key. And then there's also got a login ID value, which is a long field, which is mapped in from IDCS username or login. Basically, there is control within the system to create this 8-character user ID as a unique value. And this user record inside of each application environment controls many settings for that user. This is just a snapshot of what that user, the main tab of that user record contains, which some of which is last name, first name, for example, and login ID come from IDCS. Then there are a number of display values that you'll be setting. And the third important thing on the main tab is about the user groups inside of the system that provide the granular access to various transactions and so forth within the environment. As you'll see, there are many other settings possible as part of the user record. And to facilitate setting these various preferences and values, we also have the concept of a template user, essentially a source to copy settings from into a new user record that's created. So, and it uses the same UI, the same table. The main only difference, or the way to know that a user record is a template user, is through this user type value. When its user type is set as template user, then it's meant to be a source of copying values from. So you have control. Once you get into the environments, you have control to create as many template users as you'd like. Basically, they kind of tie to roles, various job roles, and what kind of access they should have. For example, whether they should have any access to the kind of administrative side of the system, or if they only use kind of main menu options. And then, of course, further granularity around which main menu options they might use. We also provide a template user with minimal access, just for those situations where someone's been given access to the environment, but we don't know what rights they're supposed to get, so we give them minimal access. And in that case, an administrator will probably have to help out to get them set up properly. Here's a sample of a template user that's been set up for purposes of being a template for a customer service rep, or CSR. You'll notice that the user type is template user. No one logs in with this value. It's just meant to be a source of settings for everyone who comes in as a CSR. And the creation of their user record within the application environment is only done at the time that they first log into that environment. So once they've been given, their user record's been created in IDCS or the cloud account, and they log into one of the environments, basically we go through a process to check what record how should we create their user record and access within the application. To facilitate that, we supply inside each application environment, there's what's called a master configuration that is a simple way of mapping membership in an IDCS group to a particular template user. The snapshot here just shows that if we find that the user in IDCS has been linked to the CSR group, then we're going to copy their user information from the TMPL-CSR, the template user for CSR record that we created in this environment. You have total control over what those settings might be. Once that mapping is in place, then we can do this kind of just-in-time user setup inside the application environment. And as mentioned, when the user tries to log in, given the URL for, let's say, the production environment, they will try to log in, and authentication of the user ID and password will go through IDCS. And if they've never logged in before, then we're going to check what groups are they in IDCS. What does IDCS know about them? And when we get that list of groups, we can then see if there's a mapping of the IDCS groups to template users, and if so, we can then create their user record with the appropriate setup from a template user that you've defined. So just a quick kind of review of that logic again is that the user logs into the CCS or MSCS or WAX environment URL. We authenticate with IDCS. If that's good, then we're given access to the instance. We check to see, is there already a user record inside the application for that user? If so, then we just go ahead and give them access to the environment and give them the rights that have been defined on their user record. If the user record does not exist in the application, i.e. it's their first login ever to that environment, then we call over and get the groups for that user. And then in step 5, we check to see if we have this master configuration mapping for the group to the template user. And if we do, then we can create the OUAF user record from the template user. If we don't have a mapping for it for some reason, then we're going to give minimal access, which means that the user really can't do very much of anything, but they will get to the environment without rights to make any changes. A couple things to note on this is that the after that first login, the changes, for instance, to the groups in IDCS won't really affect the settings inside the application environment unless you just completely take away the access, right? If you take away in the IDCS group, if you say, well, that group no longer has access to the dev environment, for example, then people who are only in that group won't be able to get to the dev environment anymore. But in terms of their granular rights within the environment, if they can get access to that environment, their granular rights will stay the same. And even if you make different changes to the template user record or the mapping of the IDCS group to template user, that will not go back and change any users that already exist in that environment. That would have to be done in some other manual fashion to make changes to them. There's a lot more information about OUAF users and template user records in the online documentation, so I recommend, if these concepts are not familiar to you, to check the online documentation to get a better feel for it. And that concludes this tutorial on user access in the Enterprise SaaS world with IDCS. Thank you very much.